video, we're going to show you how to make a barbecue rub out of ingredients you probably already have in your pantry. Real quick, real simple. So every good barbecue recipe starts with a good rub, and you can certainly go to your spice aisle at your local grocery store and you can pick up a rub, you know, a poultry rub, a steak rub, a Kansas City rub, a bourbon smoke rub. But making your own really is a good way to do it. It's fun to experiment with the flavors. I use one that's fairly generic for any meat you're going to do. It works with almost all of them. I do something a little different with beef typically, but for pork and chicken and sausage and even some ribs, beef or pork, this is really good. So let me kind of show you what we end up doing for this. So when I do these, I like to sort of think about it in parts. And you know, you can take any given part and assume every part is 1/4 teaspoon. If you were making just enough for a batch of, let's say, you know, 10 to 15 pieces of chicken, or you know, 2, 3 to 4 pound pork butts. But I'm going to do this in parts. I think it's just an easier way to talk about it. Let's start with all the items that we're going to use one part of. Pretty easy stuff. We're going to go ahead and start with 1 part of ground black pepper. Now, again, you can assume this is about 1/4 teaspoon. That's the size I'm going to do here. So I actually don't have coarse ground already ground up, so I'm just doing this as I go here, but it works. Also, we want to use 1/4 teaspoon or 1 part of cinnamon and even cumin. I actually don't have cumin, so I'm doing without it here, but it makes it a good flavor. Again, this doesn't have to be scientific. I'm not measuring these exact. As a matter of fact, that's a little bit heavy there. There we go. Better put this lid on before Deb does some baking and it's not on there. The other item we're going to do 1 part of is going to be cayenne pepper. You can choose how spicy you do or don't want this. This recipe also has some brown sugar in it, so it helps cut through that. It just gives you a little heat at the back of the mouth afterwards. Good stuff. Now let's talk about the items that we're going to use 2 parts for, and that's going to be granulated garlic or garlic powder, not garlic salt, garlic powder. Now, in this case, that's essentially 1/2 teaspoon if we're making this size, but 2 parts rather than 1 part. And now we're going to go to all the items that are going to be 4 parts. The first one is salt, and this is going to take a second here. That's about 1/4 teaspoon. Another 1/4 teaspoon. Another 1/4 teaspoon. Yeah, just a couple more. And you definitely want to use kosher salt for this, which is the reason why I'm grinding it. I actually don't have any left that's not already in my grinder, so I'm grinding it. But you wouldn't want to use just table salt. It wouldn't be as good. All right, we also want 4 parts of onion powder. Now, interestingly enough, we also want 4 parts of onion salt. I actually don't have any onion salt, so I'm substituting something. We love this Tony Chachere's, it's Creole seasoning. It's a seasoned salt, pre-packaged item, but I'm essentially using this in place of my, my onion salt. It just helps keep my quantities right, but we really like the flavor. And then the last thing is we're going to go ahead and do also 4 parts of paprika. Gives us some good color too. So here's the last ingredient, and this is where it starts throwing off these counts by quite a bit. If you were doing all these in teaspoons, we'd be using 1/3 cup, 1/4 cup of brown sugar. To make this easier, if we're doing this in parts, this is essentially 40 parts to what we've had before, so 40 teaspoons. That equates to a little bit more than 1/4 cup. So I'm going to go ahead and just sort of mix out here about 1/4 cup. And I'm trying to make sure I don't pack this too tight, because I definitely want it to be all broken up when I have it in here. If you were doing a measuring cup, you wouldn't be packing it tightly. It's not like when you're baking and it says a tightly packed 1/4 cup. And again, this is rub. It's more art than science. Now, I like to do this in some kind of little Tupperware container or a mason jar. Just make sure it's good and dry before you do it. I'll also say, if you live in a humid place like I do, you know, my onion powder, for example, has solid chunks in it. It's not a big deal if you use one of those and just break it up real good. Just make sure you get it into granules. The last thing you want to do is bite something that had a big old chunk of onion powder in it. So I'm just going to loosely break up this brown sugar so it'll mix in here real well where I have the scoops there. And I'm going to put the lid on, and I'm just going to shake this up. Another great way to do this is use a fork and do it, but I really like just making sure my lid's on good. Just getting a good mix on this. And then making sure as I do it, I don't have any big chunks of, like, you know, brown sugar balls where it's been packed up or something. And I've got a couple little spots where it's still balled up a little bit. I'm just going to break those up and then shake it up a little bit more. Shadow just went by. A sailboat's going down the canal. It's always very romantic seeing that. Okay, so we've got that mixed up real good, and yeah, it smells really good. A little bit of heat from the cayenne. You can definitely smell the garlic. You can smell the brown sugar in the back of it. So I think this is going to be really good. As I mentioned earlier, this is a great rub for almost any kind of lighter colored meat. I typically don't use it for beef, but I have used it on pork chops, pork loin, and any kind of poultry. I hope you found this video useful, and we'll see y'all next week when we do the next one.